We're studying this book of Numbers, this book of obedient hope and great failure, and we're at chapter 22. We're now entering this distinct section, another new distinct section in the book. For the third time, on their journey from Egypt to Canaan, the people of Israel are encamped once more, apparently for quite a lengthy period of time. Now they're at the foot of the mountain of Moab, opposite Jericho. And it's the record of what now takes place here that makes up this fifth long section, actually, of this book. Let's just briefly remember how we got here and then where we're going to go. Now, since leaving Egypt, Israel has a working tabernacle. The tribes have been organized. The priesthood is operating on their behalf. But unfortunately, as we've seen since leaving Mount Sinai, this road trip went south, you might say, very quickly. Throughout chapters 11 to 21, we've encountered 7 stories about Israel's rebelliousness as they journeyed through the wilderness. And these stories have shown us a great deal about the dark side of human nature at times. But we've also seen the covenant faithfulness of God on display. And that's been true even when the Israelites didn't know it. And in the next few chapters, there's a lot they will not know that God is doing. In chapters 22 to 24, the focus moves on to 2, I'm going to call them stubbornly stupid people. Balak, a Moabite king, and Balaam, a prophet for hire, whom Balak wants to curse God's people by his pronouncement. After chapter 24, chapter 25, there's further rebelliousness and apostasy amongst the Israelites. There's atonement again being made by the priests. And then chapter 26, we have another numbering or census of the people, and the book draws to a close with more laws about worship and the land. Now, all of this is serving to reveal once again that God is about to implicitly keep his promise that Israel will shortly enter into the land of their inheritance. But before all that, we're going to meet Balak and Balaam, and a very interesting donkey, of course. By the way, Balak, I don't know, it means waster. His name means waster. What a great name that is to have. No one wants that, do they? I hope there's no wasters here this morning. Balaam, we're not sure. It means swallower or confuser of the people. That's very apt for this man too. Now here's what happens in brief summary in chapter 22. The Moabites have heard how the Amorites were defeated at Hormah. And that was in chapter 21, and they're terrified. So Balak, their king, sought to hire this prophet to curse Israel. Now Balaam is a heathen prophet. He seems to, however, have some knowledge of the living God, and we even see that God uses him to reveal his mind concerning Israel's special status and their future blessing. In verses 7 to 14, there is this first attempt to get Balaam to curse the Israelites. Messengers come to persuade him, and they've got the fee for divination. What's the fee for divination? Well, it's the money that they want to offer him so that he will pronounce a curse on these people. But Balaam will not curse these people. God tells him that they are blessed. You cannot curse them. Verse 15, there's a second, it's a more elaborate attempt to persuade Balaam to go to Balak and do as he wants. And though Balaam knew what God's will was, he goes to the Lord, it seems, hoping that God might change his mind. And this time the Lord tells him to go with these men, but only to do what the Lord tells him. And then in verse 22, Balaam is journeying on his donkey, and we meet the angel of the Lord 3 times. And the donkey sees the angel of the Lord. He detours, turns away, and finally the donkey just lies down in frustration, cannot go forward. And by this, of course, we see that the Lord truly knows what Balaam's heart and his motives are. Just as an aside, we're not going to dwell on the beating of that poor donkey, but Proverbs 12, verse 10 tells us that we should treat animals well. Do you know that? We should. The righteous care for the needs of their animals, but the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel. Look after your pets if you have them. I have a problem with indulgence, but look after them, please. It's biblical. It's good. Now, in verse 28, we see that this donkey is given a miraculous power to speak. And this donkey rebukes this prophet. And it's only then that Balaam sees what the donkey has seen, the angel of the Lord. He's got a drawn sword, and he hears this explanation about hindering his mission. And he's chastised, and he asks that he might go home, but the angel permits the prophet to go to Balak, again on the proviso that he only speaks what the Lord tells him to say. And he goes to Balak, and we read that he's offered sacrifices to his god there, Balak, and then Balaam leads him up to a high place so that he can see the Israelite camp. That's chapter 22. Now, we might marvel, firstly, at a talking donkey. We should marvel at a talking donkey. You may have a vision here of the film Shrek, where there is very much a talking donkey. But, can I say to you, there's a lot more going on here than just a talking donkey. I hope this stuff we can benefit from greatly in this chapter. In the chapters that follow this, we read not of curses, but of blessings, the oracles of God and the pronouncements that Balaam makes on the Israelites, even speaking of a future king who would come and triumph in glorious battle. That's what Balaam is caused to say. But before we get there, what are we to make of this strange chapter and of these encounters that we read of? Now, there's a charming naivety, perhaps, in these stories that might disguise something more profound, something more profoundly theological that's going on. It's a very funny story. That is true. But we need to see that it's also deadly serious as well. And it's that contrast that's made very clear to us in this chapter. There is the stupidity and the stubbornness of humans. There is the enlightened speech of a dumb animal, a donkey. And that animal is seen to have more spiritual insight than the prophet that God is using. It's very strange, isn't it? A very strange chapter. There's a lot of money in this chapter too. Balak wants to hire this prophet at great expense. One commentator calls Balaam numbskulled, money-grabbing heathen seer. He's got a pretty strong opinion of Balaam there. It is a strange character, Balaam, and a strange chapter. There's drama, there's irony, there's paradoxes which fascinate us and perplex us in this chapter. There may be questions coming to your mind. Here's the first one. Was Balaam a saint or a sinner? Is that commentator right? Why does God seem to change his mind about letting Balaam go to Balak? What's the point of including these stories at all in the book of Numbers? Well, chiefly today, I want us to consider what we can learn about Balaam's character and his motivation, because there are strong warnings here for us to take hold of. Now, on the first reading of this chapter, perhaps you might think that Balaam is portrayed in quite a positive light. Despite being offered vast amounts of money to curse Israel in the first place, he seems steadfastly to insist on listening only to God, much to the annoyance of his sponsors. However, I think there are a number of other passages of Scripture which paint Balaam in the light that we need to see him in. Ultimately, Balaam is seen as an opponent of Israel. Someone who would have cursed the Israelites if God had not intervened. And though they often hide people's true motives, things are conveyed sometimes very indirectly. We can, I think, search for clues to find the true heart of Balaam and evaluate it, both here and in other parts of the Bible. And I think there are two things which stand out most significantly in this chapter for us today. Firstly, I think we shall see that Balaam displays the wages of wickedness in his life. Now that's what we're going to concentrate on this morning. The second thing in this account is the way that God can use evil to bring about good. Now we're going to think about that this evening. But here's our first thought. The wages of wickedness. Hopefully you can see that there are strong warnings for us in this tale of Balak and Balaam. A strong warning first about the love of money, the lure of wealth and inducements to make wrong choices and conduct false practices. And I say that despite the fact that initially Balaam seems to be unmoved by the offer of great riches. However, I think there's more going on here. In reality, I think there is something more sinister lurking under the surface. I want you to look at verse 18. Look at verse 18 of Numbers 22. We know that there's been earlier a fee for divination offered to Balaam, verse 7. But that approach was unsuccessful. It didn't get him to go to Balak. So when that proved unsuccessful, the officials come again in verse 17 saying, Balak's message, I will reward you handsomely and do whatever you say. That's reckless. Come and put a curse on these people for me. And Balaam replies, even if Balak gave me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not do anything great or small to go beyond the command of the Lord my God. You might think, that's a sensible answer. It might seem a noble reply. I think it sounds to me a bit like another incident that we find in the earlier part of our Bibles, in the book of Genesis and chapter 23. Let me tell you about Abraham, who is looking to buy a burial site for his wife Sarah, who has died. In Genesis 23, Abraham offers to purchase a field with a cave in it from a man called Ephron, who seemingly does not wish to receive any money. But listen to this exchange, Genesis 23, verse 11 onwards. No, my lord, Ephron said, listen to me, I give you the field and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so that I can bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. Do you see my point here? There's a constant harping on about money matters in Numbers 22 that might suggest that Balaam's apparent indifference was really an oblique demand for a really huge fee. The fact that he's a man swayed by money rather than by what is right and wrong is actually the point made by the Apostle Peter in his second letter in the New Testament. Under divine Revelation, Peter writes about false teachers and what their ultimate fate will be. And he says this, 2 Peter 2, verse 15, 16. They, false teachers, have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Bezer, who loved the wages of wickedness. But he was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, an animal without speech, who spoke with a human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. There's Balaam. He's mad for money under a cloak of doing what God says. And this is similar language, Peter there, used by Jude in his very small letter too in the New Testament. Jude, speaking once more about people who might initially appear to belong to the Lord, mentions this Balaam, this notorious individual. Jude writes about how ungodly people have secretly slipped in among the believers that he is addressing. And he then reviews the history of God's people, who he states were once released from slavery in Egypt, but that later God destroyed those who did not believe. We've been reading about that, haven't we? And now, Jude says, you have similar people today who may say or appear to say one thing, but who believe and who behave in quite another way. Listen to what Jude writes in verse 11. Woe to them! They have taken the way of Cain. They have rushed for profit into Balaam's error. They have been destroyed in Korah's rebellion. Balaam's error. What is Balaam's error? Beating his donkey? Well, yes, but not chiefly. There are worse things that are going to come. And Balaam's influence is going to play out in the life of the Israelites in that camp. Putting it quite simply, Balaam was a man who was prepared, as Deuteronomy 23, verse 4 and 5 confirms, was hired to put a curse on God's people. Now, the fact that God used him in other ways, and that Balaam eventually only saw what the Lord showed him, and spoke only what the Lord gave him to say, does not absolve Balaam from his basic instinct and his true motives. But for the grace of God, he would have done those terrible things for profit alone. See what money can do, will do. Balaam is a man driven by the wages of wickedness. Now, friends, the Bible has a lot to say about the dangers and the snares inherent in money. None more famous, perhaps, than Paul's clear warning to a young pastor, Timothy, about how disastrous things can be. Writing in 1 Timothy 6 about false teachers again, who have a love of money, you note. In verses 9 to 11, Paul tells them, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and to many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But you, man of God, flee from all this and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. You can't buy them, by the way. And though Paul doesn't mention Balaam by name, like Peter and Jude do in their letters, it seems to me that he could very well have this only for profit in mind when he writes what he's just written. There's a great emphasis given to the way false teachers and deniers of the truth are profiteering from their preaching and teaching even. And we can see in this new movement, in the early church, this new movement of God, that there were people even then around who were desiring to exploit the people. They would get rich on the back of this newfound faith. And Paul is writing undoubtedly about the fact that our great enemy, the devil, can use such people to ruin lives and disrupt the church and really bring scorn and shame on the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. This is serious stuff. The love of money, of course, and the ruinous effects of money goes way beyond the church. It infects every part of society, of course. You and I are to be on guard in every part of our life about the part that money will play in our hearts. We should avoid the love of money and the terrible consequences found in Balaam's error. And as I close, I want to return to the thought we had earlier about how, despite Balaam's wicked motivations, he was enabled and used by God to make known his revelations, and to make them known even, and to eventually speak blessing rather than curses upon the Lord's people. Now, we will think about this more tonight, but briefly, what's going on there? How can this be? Let me make these brief comments for now. There are repeated statements in these chapters that Balaam will only declare what the word is that God puts in his mouth. That's true. But we need to understand that the intention here is chiefly to emphasize not the truthfulness of Balaam, but the truthfulness of God. And it's the words that are important, and not the vessel that is used. Here is the origin, the intent, the inspiration of God, not the holiness of Balaam's character that we are to be focused on. You need to remember, of course, that Balaam was offered fees for divination. Now, divination was a practice that was condemned by the Lord. Something clearly he was known for doing and could be bought for the right price. In chapter 24, Balaam resorts to using omens, divinations again. These are abominable practices that were not permitted in the land of Israel. And let's not forget Balaam's donkey, if we were in danger of doing so this morning. What you see in the conduct of this animal, a simple beast who was able to discern what Balaam couldn't discern. And that was the presence of the angel of the Lord. That's very deliberate for us. The action of this donkey really prefigures the conduct of Balaam himself. You might be asking, who's the real ass in this story? You know, for just as Balaam drives on his donkey until he's brought up short by the angel of the Lord, you can think of Balak as well, driving and pushing on Balaam with more and more money to do the wrong thing. They're as bad as each other. And there's this parallelism, really, between Balaam and his donkey, which suggests to us how God has the ability to declare his word through anything and anyone. And that's not necessarily a sign of anybody's true holiness. God can use anything to deliver his word. Even false teachers sometimes utter the truth. A stopped watch is right sometimes, isn't it? Now, what we're going to consider this evening, then, is the fact that God can use anyone, anything, to be his spokesman. And ultimately, we'll see it's not who is saying what God says that matters, but what God actually says That is what matters the most. That's a lesson we need to learn from this fascinating chapter. Amen.